Let me start off with a really short story that I heard somebody uh, share just a couple years ago. I really liked it. Um, that some individuals are naturally at peace and content. And there was a psychologist who decided to study these individuals. And this is what the psychologist learned. If you can sit quietly after difficult news, if in financial downturns you remain perfectly calm, if you can see your neighbors travel to great places and not become jealous, if you can happily eat whatever's on your plate, and you can fall asleep after a day of running around without a drink or a pill, and you always seem to be able to find contentment just where you are, well, then chances are you're a dog, because that's not what most people are like. Um, by the way, I love these pictures of dogs. I'm a real fan of dogs. And I just lost my dog of 17 years age just a few weeks ago, who I desperately miss every day. But these dogs are just adorable. Um, there's another video that is on Canvas that's kind of goes into more detail about the biology of stress. I just want to start off with a key point, and that's to remind everybody that there is no such thing as merely psychological stress. That is, anytime we are feeling stressed, there are some biological things that are corresponding to that. Okay, um, and so we often refer to that as the stress response. And of course, if you think about a zebra that's being attacked by a lion, and the zebra needs to get the heck out of there, and the lion is hungry and it wants to run down the zebra and have it for dinner. In both animals, the stress response is activated, and it's very adaptive thing. Um, and humans can activate the same stress response due to short-term or even to chronic psychological stress. And I'll talk about chronic psychological stress in a minute. The stress response is, of course, very adaptive for the lion and the zebra. But when we experience chronic stress, we pay a price. It's not adaptive. And that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot in this short talk this evening. As you know, the stress response involves both our autonomic nervous system, especially what's called the sympathetic nervous system, and hormones as well. Okay, especially hormones referred to as adrenaline or epinephrine, which are the same thing, and glucocorticoids. They involve multiple parts of our brain, from the brain stem and the hypothalamus, which are kind of in the older part of our brain, evolutionary older. The limbic system, which plays a key role in our emotions, and the cortex, which, as you all recall, is the higher level, outer level of our brain, and it's the part that evolved most recently in humans. Ultimately, when we experience the stress response, our brain decides that something is a threat, and a whole cascade of events begin to happen. One of the outcomes of that is that cells in our liver begin to release glucose into our bloodstream, and that's a really good thing. Glucose is, of course, sugar, and the stress response does a number of things. It increases our blood pressure, our heart rate, and our breathing rate, and delivers nutrients to various parts of our body where they're needed. You can see how that's great for the zebra and for the lion. A number of other things happen in our brain, and at the same time, blood is diverted away from parts of our bodies that don't really need it, such as our gut and our reproductive organs, which, of course, think of the lion and the zebra. They're not worried about their gut and their reproductive organs at that point. So longer-term needs when we're under stress, such as growth and tissue repair and digestion, etc., are all inhibited. Of course, a lot of this is happening, as I say, out of our adrenal glands, which sit on top of our kidneys. Okay? And the main three areas that are involved are our hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and our adrenal glands. We won't go into details about those. You can read about this if you want. But these three things, hypothalamus, lower part of the brain, pituitary gland directly underneath the hypothalamus, adrenal glands on top of our kidneys, That's referred to as the HPA axis, and that's critical in the stress response. And all these things ultimately release a number of things that are called glucocorticoids, and those glucocorticoids do a number of things, and that are all adaptive in a real threat, but they're not adaptive in when we're simply worried about something that's not an immediate threat. So, but remember that every time you're feeling stressed, this stress response, often called the fight or flight response, is occurring at some level in your biology. And one of the big downsides of this is that as we have this ongoing physiological stress response, is that it begins to weaken our immune system. And that's one of the reasons why when we experience stress, we become much more likely and much more susceptible to experience a number of diseases. And because it's not like the stress actually started the disease, but usually our immune system can fight something off. But when we're experiencing this kind of chronic physiological stress, our immune system begins to weaken. This effect can occur over years or decades. So first big takeaway to remember is that there's no such thing as purely psychological stress. There's always something physically happening, and the longer it holds on, the less adaptive it is for you. Second big point, cannot overstate this. It is not events that cause stress. It's what we think of events that causes stress. Stated differently, our thoughts and our interpretations of events play a central role in all stress. If that was not the case, everybody who experienced an event would experience the same amount of stress. But that's not the way it works at all. Some people who experience an event experience considerable stress associated with it, often because of the way they are thinking about and interpreting the event. Other people who experience the same event might experience very little stress or almost no stress at all. We will come back to this point again. It is pivotal. So you can never just say to yourself going forward, oh, of course I'm feeling really, really stressed out because X happened. Because it's not that simple. Not that simple. Even really traumatic events, some people experience relatively little stress and others experience enormous amounts of stress. Same thing is true with very small events. Some people ignore them entirely, they don't bother them at all, and others really experience considerable stress over a long period of time. Okay? So we want to draw this distinction between acute stress, when there's an immediate threat to our well-being. Imagine you're in a car accident. If you've been in a car accident, you've probably experienced that level of physiological arousal that happens, and it's really quite something and quite palpable. It could be something smaller, but nonetheless very worrisome. You think you lost your wallet. You begin to panic. Right away, a stress response kicks in. Happened to me a few weeks ago in New York City. I actually thought I lost my wallet. Turned out I had not, but I thought I had. I was at a concert in New York, and I had no idea where it could have gone. Eventually found it, and it was okay. But that's acute stress. But chronic stress, the kind of stress that's almost always there. And animals generally don't experience chronic stress. It's something that humans tend to experience. Yeah? So why? Why do we experience chronic stress? Well, first of all, humans live in an environment that's very different from the environment in which our brains evolved. So many of the things that cause us chronic stress are relatively recent in our evolutionary history. Whether those are traffic jams or our computer dying or constant noise or being worried about the stock market or politics or frustrated at a long line or whatever it is. We also live in an environment that psychologists refer to as a delayed return environment. And what that means is that many of the things we do not get immediate feedback about it. We work on a project. Even when we finish the project, we often don't know what the long-term outcome will be. And this is true of many of the things that happen in our lives. But before the development of agriculture, which took place about 10,000 years ago in human history, people did live in an immediate return environment, not a delayed return, but an immediate return. That is, they saw the immediate consequences of their action. Was the hunt successful, for example? Did I find food today or not? And finally, there's often nothing we can do to solve the things that worry us. The threat is in the future, or it's in our mind, but it's not in the present. It's not immediate. And those kinds of conditions lead to chronic stress, which can be quite debilitating. So a number of causes: money. We worry about whether or not we have enough to meet our basic needs. What happens if my car breaks down? What about retirement? Will I have enough to retire? If you're not worried about that now, by the way, give yourself a few decades. I promise you will be. Relationships with your friends, your spouse, your kids, your coworkers. All of those things can cause chronic stress. Work and school. Many of us are not happy at work. I am lucky. I'm pretty happy at work and have been for a long time. But I've heard from many MBA students, for example, who are not. They don't like what they do, and they're looking to do something else. Of course, health issues cause chronic stress, both major and minor illnesses, and just all the daily hassles that we go through day in and day out. They all cause chronic stress. Okay? And chronic stress then tends to weaken our immune system, and therefore is associated with a huge number of visits to doctors in the developed world, because so many different kinds of things are exacerbated. That is, they are worsened by stress. They are not initially caused by stress, but they are worsened by stress. This is very true of things like back pain and neck pain. Believe me, happens all the time. Doctors will tell you this all the time. It's certainly true of headaches, a number of gastrointestinal issues, the inability to sleep, problems with our sexual functioning, anxiety, worry, all exaggerated and exacerbated by stress. On top of that, managers who experience stress do a number of things that are really counterproductive. They tend to focus only on information that confirms their initial expectations. Really bad problem in decision making. They fixate on one approach to a problem rather than thinking about other ways to approach the problem. We overestimate how quickly time is going by. We adopt a crisis mentality and we don't consider long-term implications of our behavior. We listen to others less. We consult with others less. We rely on our old habits to deal with current situations, even though those habits are not going to be helpful. And all the research suggests we become much less creative. The basic idea here is this: the model in the textbook. We start off with stressors. Stressors are things that might cause stress. I'm not arguing they necessarily will, but they might. So they often trigger stress. And the reason why they don't always trigger stress is because it's not the events that lead to stress. It's what we think of the events. These stressors, if we interpret them in a way that we begin to experience stress, can lead to both, as I said, physiological and psychological reactions. But those reactions can be buffered if we develop resiliency. And that's one of the big takeaways here. Your goal is to develop both physical resiliency through exercise and diet, and psychological resiliency, which we'll talk about a bit more, and social resiliency, which occurs mainly through friendships and social contacts. Okay, there's an assignment that I'm not going to go into details about here that is about job burnout. So you folks on Canvas, there is a link to a job burnout survey and how to interpret that survey. So that's important, and a short video that explains that. But you can think of burnout as being the opposite of engagement. So that's one way to think about it, a burnout. At one end of a continuum, we can become emotionally exhausted, emotionally cynical, where we begin to distance ourselves from others and step away from events. And we can experience a sense of inefficacy. That is, we don't think we're accomplishing much. At another end of the continuum, where we're very engaged, we feel energized by our work. We don't feel, oh my God, I've got to do this. No, we feel energized. We're excited. We're engaged. We're caught up in it. We're involved with others, and we look forward to being involved with others. And we have a sense of efficacy that we're accomplishing things. So burnout is a big thing. It's the one thing I will say about burnout is that it can be quite seasonal for many of us. If you have a high burnout score at one time, it doesn't mean you'll have a high burnout score 6 months from then. So I want to emphasize that, but I'm going to stop talking about burnout here because there's plenty of information on Canvas about that. Okay. So what I want to do is begin to talk about how to cope with stress. Okay. So this is the big point of the book, a really important point. It argues there are three basic approaches to dealing with stress. Those are listed in the top row. The first approach is to try to reduce or eliminate the number of stressors that we face. It is impossible to eliminate all stressors, but we can learn to reduce them. And I will talk a bit about that, especially when it comes to time management. Secondly, we can try to focus on developing resiliency. I already mentioned that. Resiliency, when we do experience stressors that cause us anxiety and worry and stress, it makes us able to be resilient to that, so we do not become overwhelmed by them. Key takeaway here is that resiliency is something that you have to build before the stressor happens. Finally, we can have a reactive response, a short-term coping mechanism. You're feeling stressed. Suddenly you're worried. What do? And you come up with these short-term coping strategies. That's not bad. Some of us learn to relax our muscles. Some of us learn to bring to mind images that we find relaxing. Some of us learn breathing techniques. But all those things are reactions to stress we're already feeling, and hence are not the most effective approach. Our biggest approach is let's see if we can reduce the number of stressors we face and develop resiliency. So that said, let's talk about stressors. Again, stressors are events. They might cause stress, but they might not, because it's not the event that causes stress, it's what we think of those events, how we interpret and think about the event. To pick an extreme example of this, I have a cousin who is quite a number of years older than I am, and he passed away about a month ago. And he knew this was going to be happening. He had had cancer for about 1.5 years, and after a number of treatments that were initially helpful, he kind of ran out of potential treatments, and the doctors really ran out of things, even at a great medical center in a large city. It was interesting, though, to talk to him because he was worried about the effect his passing would have on his wife, but he didn't show any signs of being especially stressed. He actually seemed to accept what was happening to him. He was older. He'd led a good life. He was surrounded by family, but he wasn't especially stressed and panicked. Another woman I know who passed away a few years ago from cancer was very different. She was always, whenever you spoke with her, was extremely panicked, extremely panicked. And that's an interesting example where something that is an event that almost all of us would say, that's a stressor, and boy, that's going to cause stress. And it did in both of them, but in very different ways. And that's because they were thinking about their own passing in very different ways. Quite remarkable. So we're going to talk about 4 kinds of stressors. One type of stressor is time, having too much to do in too little time. I bet you a lot of you feel that way right now. You're working full time. Many of you have a family. You have plenty of other commitments, and in the middle of all of it, you're taking these 8-week courses that give you a lot of work to do. Wow. You know, the absence of what appears to be enough time is certainly a potential source of stress. Another type of stressor is encounters with people. Sometimes these encounters involve simply disagreements about how to handle an issue, but sometimes they're interpersonal conflicts, both at work or outside of work. Well, those things can certainly be big stressors, but not to everybody. Another type of stressor is what's referred to as situational. And those are people who are working in unfavorable working conditions or experiencing rapid change. If you're in a business, a company, an organization, or even a department that's going through a lot of change right now, and you're in the middle of it, for many people, that is a stressor. But others not. They're experiencing the same thing you're experiencing, but they actually react to the change somewhat positively. Quite remarkable. And the last kind, which I have a perfect example of that occurred finally finished today, is what's called an anticipatory stressor. This is when we are worried about something that might or might not happen, but you keep worrying about it. Well, there's tons of stuff. Well, will this relationship last? Will my marriage do okay? Boy, I'm worried about my kid now, who's is 16 years old. And will they get into a decent college? And you're worried about all these different things. As a kind of an example of an anticipatory stressor, I developed about 6 or 7 weeks ago a bump on my head, on the top of my head, and I could feel it, and it was definitely a bump, and it had never been there before. And of course, I have a tendency to have anticipatory stressors. That is, I begin to worry. What is that bump? Oh, that could be really bad. I wonder what it is. Could I have brain cancer? What else could be going on? What's going on? What's going on? And you start worrying about this. That's referred to as an anticipatory stressor. Nothing is actually happening to you at that moment at all. You're just worried. I actually just came from a dermatologist 6-month skin checkup today and found out that the thing on my head is a very incredibly benign little thing that happens a lot when people get, I think they call them keratosis, I think they call it. And he just put some liquid nitrogen on it, froze it off. But believe me, I spent weeks worrying about that and devoting a number of points during my day where I was worried about that. That's called an anticipatory stressor. So there are a number of ways we can eliminate these kinds of stressors, and the textbook goes through them. I want to start with time management, and so we'll show you this quick cartoon here. Like that. Maybe that's what happened to the dinosaurs. I don't know. Anyways, in your textbook, there is a chart that looks like this. I consider this one of the big takeaways. You can think about all the tasks and activities that you have to do in terms of how important they are and how urgent they are. Now, I want to emphasize that that's a subjective thing. You might decide that something is urgent that somebody else might not think of as being urgent. You might decide that something is very important, although somebody else won't think it's important. Or maybe your boss thinks it's really important, but you don't think it's really important. But the bottom line is we can think about these kind of a continuum where things range from low urgency to very high urgency. And in terms of importance, they range from being relatively low importance to quite high importance. And so you've got some simple examples here. Some of us, every day, we probably deal with some things that are urgent and important. I try to get up each day and check Canvas to see if I've heard anything from my students in my MBA 810 class. Well, I kind of put some urgency on that. I don't have to do it, but I generally do it each day. And I think it's important to do it. You have very little chance to interact with me. You don't meet me face to face. So that's something I think is pretty important to do. Of course, there are a number of things that are actually not really important at all. But many of us treat them as urgent. I've got to respond to this email right away. I've got to respond to that message. I've got to pick up the phone right away. Boy, there's an unscheduled interruption, and I have to deal with it. I have to talk to this person right now. Some things, of course, are obviously not important or urgent, and we devote time to those things. I do that, and I bet you do it too. As an example for me, as a way to escape for me is often that at night, if I'm around the house, which I'm not always, but if I am, I put on Jeopardy at 7 o'clock. And that's a great escape for me. I think it's fun to see if I can get some things right. And so all of us have those kinds of things, right? God knows how many episodes of Law and Order I have watched in my life, or NCIS. Those are escapes. And then finally, we have this other category, and this is the one I want to really emphasize. These are activities that are not urgent. That is, they don't have to be done today at all. They may not even have to be done tomorrow or this week, but they're potentially very important. You're going to school is an example of that. You don't have to do this. It's not urgent, but you're doing it, so you think it's important. Here's the big thing in terms of time management. You don't get better at time management by becoming more efficient at the way you use time. I'm going to say that again. You don't get better by becoming more efficient at the way you use time. You get better by spending more time on things that are not urgent but are potentially important. That is, people who are really good at time management spend more time in quadrant 3 during the course of a week than do other people. In my field, for example, research never has to be done today. It never has to be done tomorrow. It doesn't have to be done this month. But if you want to have a successful career, you're going to have to find some time each week to devote to research. And some people don't do that very much. They're not really good at it. They kind of wait until they say everything else is done. I won't have anything else to do, and then I'll focus on research. But that time never comes. This is one of the few skills I have in life. I've been good throughout my career at spending time on things like research and course development. And none of those things are urgent, but they are important, and they have contributed, I think, in many ways to the successes I've had in my career relative to others. So the idea is that you want to devote time to things that are important but not urgent. And one of the takeaways I want you to be thinking about, how much of that are you doing each week? Each week. Maybe not every day, but each week. Okay. I want to talk a bit about resiliency. And one of the key points I want to make about resiliency is right in front of you now. This is from a chart that is in your textbook. I call it kind of a life balance drawing. And we could argue, at least I think I could make a pretty persuasive argument, that almost everything we do in our lives, activities, falls into one of these slices. Many of us spend a lot of our time on work activities in green. For you folks, you probably also spend a lot of time on what I would call intellectual activities, school. And that means you might not have much time to spend in other slices on this graphic here. But here's the key resiliency point I want to make to you. Some people are very imbalanced about where they're spending their time. Almost all of their time is going into one or two slices in this graphic. But others are spending at least reasonable amounts of time in all of these slices, or almost all of these slices. I'll ask you to think about that as you write your skills analysis paper. And I want you to think about it as a goal for time management as well. Here's the idea. What we know is that people who are fairly balanced across all these different colors, about all these different categories of activities, those who are fairly balanced, they are much more resilient to stress than are others who spend almost all of their time in just one or two of these slices, one or two of these areas. So again, coming back to time management, the trick isn't to become more efficient and thereby spend time doing what you're already doing, just doing more of it. The trick is to spend time doing things that you're not doing that will build your resiliency and that will make you more successful. So it's not about efficiency, it's about shifting where you're spending your time. At the beginning, as I said just recently, the focus should be on spending more time in quadrant 3. Doing things that might not be urgent today or urgent this week, but they are potentially important. And almost everybody I've seen succeed in their careers spends more time doing that than people who get stuck. And people who have a variety of these activities that are in the different colors here, and at least devote some time to those things every week or so, those people are much more resilient to stress. Okay. Another important dimension that, again, I'm not going to talk a lot about here because it's an assignment for you, is to complete the Type A personality scale. There's a link to that in Canvas. And you'll be asked in the assignment for this week to talk a bit about the extent to which you are Type A or not Type A. Type A behavior, one simple way to describe it is that people who are very Type A create their own stress. They don't need an event. They'll create their own stress. Their tendency to be highly impatient, highly competitive, highly over-involved in work, and a tendency to get angry or hostile too frequently, those tendencies, any one of those four tendencies, leads to what we call Type A personality. High levels of stress and considerable evidence again suggests can lead to illness. And the hostility anger tendency, by the way, is a particularly strong predictor of heart disease. So one should be, in fact, it's such a strong predictor of heart disease that it's at least as good at predicting heart disease and heart attacks as our high levels of cholesterol, serum cholesterol. Another way to build resilience is to engage in what's called pro-social behavior. So pro-social behavior is this tendency to want to do things for others. You're not worried about what others are doing for you, but you're doing things for others. You're constantly looking throughout the day about how you can be helpful to others. There'll also be a very nice link to a TED Talk that's also part of your upcoming work on Canvas. That's presents Adam Grant from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, talking about this tendency that some people simply just give much more than others. They don't expect their giving to be matched by anything. They just do. And those people not only tend to have long-term career success, but they also, due to the often social interactions that come with that, and that kind of social interactions, develop a lot of resiliency. One of the biggest things that can make you resilient to stress is having friends to talk to about it. These are not friends who are acquaintances who are just talking to you about, how's the March Madness going and who do you think's going to win in this week's Sweet 16 games. No. These are people you can talk to about things that are deeply bothering you. And those kinds of social contacts, again, enormously important in building resilience to stress. I won't talk a lot about mindfulness here, but there are simple tricks to learn mindfulness and daily meditation. It only takes about 10 minutes a day. There are tons of examples of how to do this on YouTube and on the internet. Again, massive amounts of research suggest that this daily mindfulness and meditation, again, helps you build resilience to stress. So I want to kind of wrap up today, and as I said, I wanted to take less than 45 minutes, and I'm going to be able to do that by telling you a story that some of you may have heard. I have heard several versions of this story, but I call it the story of the rocks and the mason jar. So if you don't know what a mason jar looks like, there's one in the picture. Mason jars can be little or very big. Here's how this story goes. I don't know if this story is apocryphal or real. I'm not really sure, but it's a great story nonetheless and makes a great point. Here's how it goes. A bunch of Ivy League MBA students, elite MBA programs at Ivy universities, are in a class. These people are, of course, all very bright. If you're in an Ivy League MBA program, your GMAT scores were probably almost for certain above 750. Your undergraduate GPAs were really, really high. You've got at least 5 to 7 years of full-time work experience during which you have demonstrated considerable career growth. In this class, somebody comes in to talk to them about time management. And this expert brings a big box, and from this big box, he takes out a big mason jar. And then he starts taking out some big jagged rocks, and he starts putting them into the mason jar. You can imagine somebody putting in some relatively large kind of jagged rocks into the mason jar, and finally reaches a point where he's trying to put in another jagged rock, but it won't fit. And he's holding this big jagged rock, and he says to people in the class, do you think I can get anything else in there? And they say, no, it looks like I don't think you're going to get any other rocks in there. And he says, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe there's something else I could get in there. So what he does is he takes out some small pebbles, small rounded pebbles, and he starts pouring those into the jar. And of course, naturally, they kind of fall around and spill around the large jagged rocks, fill up the jar. And then he says, do you think I can get anything else in? And so they're smart Ivy League MBA students, so they say, I bet you can. So yeah, sure enough, he takes out some sand, some fine-grained sand, and he starts pouring the sand in until that fills up the mason jar, and it starts spilling out. He says, you think I can get anything else? And at this point, they're kind of laughing, and they're wondering what's going on. And he takes out some water, and he starts pouring the water in until the water, rises to the top and spills out of the mason jar. And then he finally says, well, what's the point, do you think, of my little illustration here? And one of these really smart type A MBA students says, well, I think the point is probably that often when you think you've done as much as you can, you can do more. When you might be thinking that you're good at managing time, but you know what? There's always more you can do. There's always more that you can accomplish. And this guy who's doing the demonstration says, it's interesting. And of course, a lot of the MBA students are nodding their head. But the guy who's doing the demonstration says, that's interesting, but that's not what I was thinking. Here's what I was thinking. I was thinking that you got to put the big rocks in first. Say it again. I was thinking that you got to put the big rocks in first, because if you start putting in the pebbles and the sand and the water first, there won't be any room at all for the big rocks. You will have used up the jar. There's nothing there for the big rocks. And so now the question becomes, what are the big rocks? And the big rocks are the things that are important but not urgent. And the slices of that life balance wheel, that life balance circle that I showed you, that are not adequately filled up, in your opinion. It's not trying to get more in the slices you're already working in. So again, the trick in managing stress is not just using your time more efficiently. It's learning how to think about events as not being catastrophic, building resilience, and importantly, right, spending time on things that are important but not necessarily urgent before you do some other things. Because if you don't do that, you will never get those things done. You will never get them done. So those are the big takeaways for me about this chapter and about this concept. They seem very basic, but most people don't really follow through on these prescriptions. I hope you will, because I think they'll make a really big difference in your life. So that's the end of our session this evening. I hope you've gotten something from it. If you've got any feedback for me, I would love to get your feedback. And so it's time, as I said, for us to kind of bring this to a close. And this recording will be posted if you want to look at it again. But I hope I've been able to focus your attention so that you're not equally focused on all the many, 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 many things in the chapter. But instead, you're focused on a handful of takeaways that'll make a big difference in your life and your career. And they have in mind. And I've seen them make that difference in the careers of others as well. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening.